What if the most powerful court in America ordered you returned home, but you were trapped in a foreign prison with no way out? Imagine being torn from your 5-year-old son without even a chance to say goodbye, then sent to one of the most dangerous prisons in the Western Hemisphere, all because of a government administrative error. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, whose wrongful deportation and extraordinary journey home will take you inside America's immigration system in a way you've never seen before. Today on Story-Driven English, we present A Journey Home, The Fight for Justice, a gripping account of one family's battle against a seemingly unstoppable deportation machine and the landmark Supreme Court ruling that could change thousands of lives. If you're looking to dramatically improve your English vocabulary while understanding complex legal concepts through a human story that will stay with you long after this video ends, you found exactly what you need. Before we begin this extraordinary journey together, take a moment right now to subscribe to Story-Driven English and hit the notification bell. Our subscribers tell us they've mastered critical vocabulary and gained confidence in their English comprehension through our uniquely engaging storytelling approach. Don't just learn English, experience it through stories that matter. Hit subscribe now to join thousands of learners who've discovered that the most powerful way to master a language is through emotionally compelling narratives. Now, let's step into Kilmar's world, where a single morning commute with his son turned into a 7-week nightmare that would test the limits of America's highest court. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick concrete walls of La Esperanza prison, casting only a thin strip of light across the cold floor of cell block D. A Journey Home, The Fight for Justice. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick concrete walls of La Esperanza prison, casting only a thin strip of light across the cold floor of cell block D. Inside one of these cells, Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia sat on the edge of his narrow cot, staring at the photograph he had managed to keep hidden during the chaos of his sudden deportation. The image showed a smiling 5-year-old boy sitting on a swing set in a Baltimore park, his eyes bright with the innocent joy that only children possess. 3 weeks had passed since Kilmar had been torn from his life in Maryland and sent to El Salvador, a country he had fled 15 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now sat in one of the most dangerous prisons in a country he had left because of violence, despite a U.S. immigration judge's specific ruling that he could not be deported to El Salvador due to credible safety concerns. "Abrego," a guard called, his voice echoing in the concrete corridor. "Visita." Kilmar looked up, surprised. He had no family left in El Salvador, no friends who knew of his return. Who would be visiting him? He followed the guard through a maze of corridors, the walls covered with gang graffiti that served as territorial markers and warnings. La Esperanza housed members of rival gangs, political prisoners, and common criminals in an uneasy coexistence that frequently erupted into violence. As a deportee from America, Kilmar was viewed with suspicion by all factions, existing in a dangerous limbo. The visiting area consisted of a long room divided by a thick glass partition with telephones for communication. On the other side of the glass sat a woman Kilmar had never seen before, dressed in a crisp white blouse and dark blazer that marked her as different from the usual visitors to the prison. "Señor Abrego Garcia," she said in accented Spanish as he took his seat opposite her. "My name is Julia Menendez. I'm an attorney with the International Refugee Assistance Project. I'm here because there have been significant developments in your case in the United States." Kilmar's heart raced as he gripped the telephone receiver tighter. What developments? The Supreme Court of the United States has issued a ruling on your deportation, Julia said, her expression carefully controlled. They have ordered the U.S. government to facilitate your return to the United States. The words hung in the air between them, almost too incredible to comprehend. Kilmar had given up hope of returning to his son, to the life he had built over 15 years. The suddenness of his arrest and deportation had left no time for legal challenges or goodbyes. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julia opened a folder on her lap. "Your deportation was illegal, Mr. Abrego Garcia. In 2019, an immigration judge specifically granted you withholding of removal to El Salvador due to the threats against your life here. That protection was still in effect when ICE officers arrested and deported you last month." She paused, allowing him to process this information before continuing. "Your wife, Jennifer, immediately filed an emergency habeas corpus petition with the help of attorneys in Maryland. The case moved quickly through the courts because the violation was so clear." Kilmar closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion at the mention of Jennifer. They had married 3 years ago, but she was still pursuing her U.S. citizenship. Their son, Miguel, was a U.S. citizen by birth. "Jennifer and Miguel," he said, opening his eyes. "Are they okay?" "They're advocating tirelessly for you," Julia assured him. "Jennifer has been speaking to the press, working with attorneys, contacting congressional representatives. Your son misses you terribly, but he's safe." Julia explained how the case had unfolded. A federal district judge in Maryland had ordered the government to return Kilmar to the United States within 48 hours, recognizing the clear error in his deportation. When the administration appealed, arguing that courts lacked jurisdiction once a person was outside U.S. borders, the case had moved rapidly through the appeals process to the Supreme Court. "The Supreme Court's ruling is significant," Julia continued. "They stated that the government must facilitate your return to the United States. However, they stopped short of requiring the government to effectuate your return, which has created some ambiguity about exactly what steps the administration must take." Kilmar leaned forward. "What does that mean for me?" "It means we've won an important victory, but our work isn't done," Julia said candidly. "The administration has acknowledged that your deportation was an administrative error, but they're moving slowly on implementing the court's order. They're arguing that they can't force El Salvador to release you, even though your detention here is a direct result of their illegal deportation." The cruel irony of the situation wasn't lost on Kilmar. The same U.S. government that had determined it was too dangerous for him to be in El Salvador had mistakenly sent him there, and now claimed limited ability to correct their error. "So what happens now?" he asked. "We're pursuing multiple strategies," Julia explained. "First, we're working with the State Department to secure your release from this prison. The U.S. provided funding to El Salvador to detain deportees, so they have leverage. Second, we're maintaining pressure through the courts in the U.S. to force the administration to comply with the Supreme Court's order. And third, we're building public awareness of your case." She showed him newspaper clippings and printouts of online articles covering his situation. His story had attracted attention because it illustrated the human consequences of aggressive deportation policies and raised questions about due process and the rule of law. "Your case is becoming a symbol," Julia said. "It demonstrates what can happen when deportations are conducted hastily, without proper review of individual circumstances or legal protections." Kilmar studied the images in the articles, hardly recognizing himself in the somber man pictured standing next to Jennifer at a community event in Baltimore the previous year. Another photo showed Jennifer at a press conference, holding Miguel's hand as she spoke into a cluster of microphones. "She looks exhausted," he observed quietly. "She's remarkably strong," Julia replied. "But yes, this has been an ordeal for your family. That's why we need to get you home as quickly as possible." As their meeting concluded, Julia promised to return soon with updates. Kilmar was led back to his cell, his mind racing with new possibilities. For the first time since his deportation, he allowed himself to imagine returning to Baltimore, embracing his son, rebuilding the life that had been so abruptly interrupted. But as he passed through the violent heart of La Esperanza, the harsh reality of his current situation tempered his hope. The Supreme Court might have ruled in his favor, but he remained in one of the most dangerous prisons in the Western Hemisphere, his fate dependent on the actions of a government that had already demonstrated its willingness to ignore his legal rights. That night, as he lay on his cot listening to the unsettling symphony of prison sounds, Kilmar reflected on the twisted path that had led him to this moment. 15 years earlier, he had fled El Salvador after receiving death threats from gang members targeting his family's small business. The journey north had been perilous, but the promise of safety had outweighed the risks. In Maryland, he had rebuilt his life from nothing, learning English, securing steady work in construction, paying taxes under a tax identification number, and becoming an active member of his community. He had applied for asylum, and while his application was ultimately denied, the immigration judge had granted him withholding of removal specifically to El Salvador, recognizing the legitimate danger he faced there. 4 years, he had lived and worked legally in the United States under this protection, reporting regularly to immigration authorities as required. His marriage to Jennifer had brought him happiness he hadn't thought possible, and the birth of their son had completed his sense of belonging in America. All of that had shattered one ordinary Tuesday morning when ICE officers surrounded his car as he drove Miguel to school. They had given him no opportunity to explain his protected status, no chance to contact an attorney, no time to say a proper goodbye to his terrified 5-year-old son. Within 72 hours, he was on a plane to El Salvador, where authorities immediately took him into custody. Now, the highest court in the United States had acknowledged the wrongfulness of his deportation. But acknowledgement wasn't the same as remedy, and each day in La Esperanza brought new dangers from inmates who viewed him with suspicion or guards who saw deportees as deserving of special harassment. Kilmar tucked his son's photograph beneath his thin mattress and closed his eyes, trying to focus on Julia's words, on the possibility of return, on the power of the Supreme Court's ruling. It was a lifeline in the darkness, fragile but real. In a modest apartment in East Baltimore, Jennifer Vasquez sat at her kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Miguel had finally fallen asleep after another difficult bedtime, his questions about his father's whereabouts becoming increasingly difficult to answer in age-appropriate ways. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his father is in prison in another country because of a government mistake? The apartment felt emptier, smaller somehow, without Kilmar's presence. His tools still hung neatly organized on the wall of the small balcony where he had created a workshop for his weekend projects. His clothes remained untouched in the closet, as if disturbing them might somehow make his absence more permanent. Jennifer's phone vibrated with an incoming call. It was Simon Sandoval-Moschenberg, one of the attorneys working on Kilmar's case. She had spoken with him earlier that day after the Supreme Court ruling was announced, but he had been rushing between media interviews and hadn't had time for a detailed discussion. "Jennifer, I wanted to check in now that the dust has settled a bit," Simon said when she answered. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," she replied, her voice betraying her exhaustion. Miguel finally fell asleep. "He keeps asking when his dad is coming home, and I don't know what to tell him anymore." "That's actually why I'm calling," Simon said, his tone cautiously optimistic. "We've had some movement. The State Department has formally requested that El Salvador release Kilmar into U.S. custody. They're sending a diplomatic note acknowledging that his deportation was contrary to U.S. law and requesting cooperation in remedying the situation." Jennifer straightened in her chair. "Does that mean they'll let him go?" "It's a positive step, but we need to be realistic about the time frame. The Salvadoran government may use this as a negotiating opportunity, seeking concessions on other matters. And there's still resistance within some factions of the administration despite the Supreme Court's ruling." "I don't understand how there can be any debate," Jennifer said, frustration evident in her voice. "The Supreme Court has spoken. A federal judge ordered his return. Even the government admits deporting him was a mistake. Why is this so complicated?" Simon sighed. "Because it involves multiple countries, complex legal questions about jurisdiction once someone is outside U.S. borders, and unfortunately, political considerations as well. The administration campaigned on aggressive deportation policies. Admitting such a significant error and visibly working to correct it doesn't align with their messaging. So my husband remains in danger because of politics," Jennifer stated flatly. "Partly, yes," Simon admitted. "But the Supreme Court ruling gives us powerful leverage. The administration can delay, but they cannot ignore a direct order from the highest court. That's why I believe Kilmar will come home. The question is when and through what process." After finishing the call, Jennifer walked quietly to Miguel's room. The boy was asleep, clutching the framed family photo that usually sat on his bedside table. Jennifer gently loosened his grip and returned the frame to its place, studying the image of the three of them at Baltimore's Inner Harbor the previous summer, ice cream cones in hand, squinting into the sun. That day felt like it belonged to another lifetime now, before armed officers had separated their family, before frantic phone calls to attorneys and tearful explanations to Miguel, before the crushing uncertainty of not knowing when or if they would be together again. Jennifer had grown up in Baltimore, the daughter of immigrants who had come from El Salvador with green cards during the Civil War in the 1980s. She had never experienced the precariousness that shadowed so many immigrant families until she fell in love with Kilmar and began to understand the complex legal landscape he navigated daily. Even with his protected status, there had always been anxiety hovering in the background of their lives. But they had made peace with it, focusing instead on building their family, contributing to their community, and planning for Miguel's future. Kilmar had been taking night classes in preparation for applying to community college, dreaming of becoming an architect rather than just building others' designs. All those dreams now hung suspended, waiting on diplomatic negotiations and court interpretations. Jennifer returned to the kitchen and began organizing the scattered papers into neat folders. She had another meeting with congressional staff tomorrow, another interview with a local news station, another rally organized by the Immigrant Rights Coalition that had embraced their cause. The exhaustion was bone deep, but there was no time to succumb to it. Not when Kilmar remained in La Esperanza. Not when Miguel asked daily when his father would return. Not when each passing day in detention increased the dangers Kilmar faced. Jennifer opened her laptop to review her talking points for tomorrow's interviews. The Supreme Court ruling had created momentum, but she knew from bitter experience how quickly public attention could shift. She needed to keep Kilmar's story alive, to ensure that the administration felt constant pressure to act on the court's order. As she worked late into the night, Jennifer remembered something Kilmar had told her about his journey to America 15 years earlier. When faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, he had adopted a simple mantra: un paso más, one more step. It had carried him through desert crossings, through the years of uncertainty while his asylum case proceeded, through the disappointment of denial and the relief of receiving withholding of removal. Now it would carry them both through this latest challenge. One more step, one more day, one more effort until Kilmar returned home. In Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court's ruling on Abrego Garcia versus Department of Homeland Security sent ripples through the political establishment. The case represented a rare direct challenge to the administration's aggressive deportation policies, and the court's decision requiring the government to facilitate Kilmar's return highlighted the tension between executive authority and judicial oversight in immigration matters. At the White House, officials gathered in the Roosevelt Room to discuss the implications of the ruling and formulate a response strategy. The meeting included representatives from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the State Department, and key presidential advisors. "Let's be clear about what this ruling does and doesn't require," began the Solicitor General, who had argued the case before the Supreme Court. "The court mandates that we facilitate Abrego Garcia's return, but explicitly rejected the district court's order that we effectuate his return. That distinction gives us room to maneuver." "Define maneuver," the President's Chief of Staff said sharply. "We're not looking to evade a Supreme Court ruling." "Of course not," the Solicitor General responded smoothly. "I'm suggesting that we have discretion in how we implement the order. We can argue that facilitate means removing legal barriers to his return and making diplomatic requests, not physically extracting him from Salvadoran custody." The Secretary of Homeland Security shook his head. "That's a dangerously narrow interpretation that could provoke further judicial intervention. And let's acknowledge reality here. We made a significant error. Our own records confirmed his withholding of removal status. He should never have been on that deportation flight." "Errors happen in any large system," countered a senior advisor known for his hardline stance on immigration. "The bigger issue is the precedent this sets. If we enthusiastically work to return someone we deported, we undermine the administration's position that deportations should be swift and irreversible." The discussion continued in this vein, revealing the fundamental tension between adhering to the rule of law and maintaining the administration's tough immigration policies. Eventually, a compromise approach emerged. The government would take visible steps to comply with the ruling while moving deliberately rather than urgently. The State Department would formally request Abrego Garcia's release. The Department of Homeland Security would prepare for his potential return by clarifying his legal status, and the White House would issue a carefully worded statement acknowledging the court's ruling while emphasizing its limited scope. What no one in the Roosevelt room mentioned explicitly was the human reality at the center of these legal and political calculations. A father separated from his 5-year-old son, a husband torn from his wife, a man with legal protection from deportation nonetheless sitting in one of the most dangerous prisons in the Western Hemisphere because of an administrative error. As the meeting concluded, the President's Chief of Staff pulled the State Department representative aside. "Make sure the diplomatic note to El Salvador is substantive," he said quietly. "The President doesn't want this dragging out in the courts and the press for months. Find a way to resolve it expeditiously while saving face." The diplomatic machinery began moving, though not with the urgency Jennifer Vasquez and the legal team had hoped for. The American Embassy in San Salvador delivered a formal diplomatic note to the Salvadoran Ministry of Foreign Affairs, acknowledging the error in Kilmar's deportation and requesting cooperation in facilitating his return to the United States. The Salvadoran government responded with diplomatic caution, neither refusing the request nor immediately granting it. Officials indicated they would need to review the circumstances of Kilmar's detention and consult with various ministries before making a determination. This bureaucratic response masked a calculation taking place within the Salvadoran government. The United States had provided substantial funding for El Salvador's efforts to detain and process deportees, including money specifically allocated for the section of La Esperanza where Kilmar was held. This created both leverage and complication in the negotiations around his release. 2 weeks after the Supreme Court ruling, with diplomatic discussions ongoing but no resolution in sight, Judge Paula Zines of the U.S. District Court in Maryland called an emergency hearing. Frustrated by the administration's slow pace in implementing the Supreme Court's order, she demanded details of specific actions taken to secure Kilmar's return. Department of Justice attorneys presented a timeline of diplomatic communications and internal policy reviews, arguing that the government was making good faith efforts to comply with the ruling while respecting Salvadoran sovereignty. Judge Zines was unimpressed. "The situation we face is entirely of the government's creation," she stated firmly. Mr. Abrego Garcia had legal protection from deportation to El Salvador specifically because of the dangers he would face there. The government erroneously deported him to those very dangers, and now he sits in a prison partly funded by U.S. taxpayer dollars. This court finds the pace of remedial action unacceptable. She issued a new order requiring the government to file daily status reports detailing concrete steps taken to secure Kilmar's return and to designate a senior official to serve as the point person for implementation of the Supreme Court's ruling. The judge's forceful intervention intensified pressure on both the U.S. and Salvadoran governments, moving Kilmar's case from diplomatic backchannels to priority status. 3 days later, the Salvadoran Ministry of Justice announced that they would release Kilmar from La Esperanza into the custody of U.S. officials for return to the United States, citing humanitarian considerations and respect for the rule of law. When Julia Menendez arrived at La Esperanza to inform Kilmar of this development, she found him in the prison infirmary, being treated for injuries sustained in an altercation with other inmates. His left eye was swollen shut, and a crude bandage covered a laceration on his forehead. "What happened?" she asked, alarmed by his condition. "Some inmates discovered I had lived in the U.S. for 15 years, Kilmar explained grimly. "They decided I must be working with American authorities, possibly reporting on gang activities. I tried to explain my situation, but—" He gestured to his injuries. The attack underscored the urgency of securing his release. Julia informed him of the Salvadoran government's decision and the arrangements being made for his transfer to U.S. custody. "When?" Kilmar asked simply. "2 days," Julia replied. "An official from the U.S. Embassy will come here with the necessary paperwork. You'll be transferred directly to the airport and flown to Washington, D.C., where your wife and son will meet you." Kilmar closed his uninjured eye briefly, overwhelmed by emotion. After weeks of uncertainty, after the disorientation of sudden deportation and the terror of imprisonment in La Esperanza, the prospect of reunion with his family seemed almost too fragile to believe in. "Is this real?" he asked quietly. Julia nodded, reaching across to squeeze his hand briefly. "It's real, Kilmar. The Supreme Court's order is being implemented. You're going home." The next 48 hours passed with excruciating slowness. Kilmar was kept in the infirmary, separated from the general prison population for his safety. He barely slept, his mind cycling between hope and anxiety, between visualizing the moment he would hold Miguel again and fearing some last-minute complication would derail his return. On the morning of his scheduled release, Kilmar was given back the clothes he had been wearing when deported from the United States 2 sports earlier. The jeans and button-down shirt hung loosely on his frame. He had lost weight during his incarceration. The only possession he had to reclaim was his wallet, which contained his Maryland driver's license, a few dollars in American currency, and the photograph of Miguel that had sustained him through his time in La Esperanza. A prison official led him to an administrative office where Julia waited alongside a woman Kilmar didn't recognize, who introduced herself as Sarah Collins from the U.S. Embassy. There were forms to sign, procedures to complete, but these bureaucratic details passed in a blur as Kilmar focused on the reality that each signature brought him closer to freedom, closer to home. As they left La Esperanza, Kilmar squinted in the bright Salvadoran sunlight, his injured eye particularly sensitive. A black SUV with diplomatic plates waited in the parking lot. He paused before entering the vehicle, looking back at the imposing concrete walls of the prison where he had spent the most terrifying weeks of his life since fleeing El Salvador 15 years earlier. "Okay?" Julia asked gently, noting his hesitation. Kilmar nodded. "Just making sure this isn't a dream." The drive to the airport passed through San Salvador's congested streets, the city simultaneously familiar and foreign to Kilmar. He had grown up not far from here, but the urban landscape had changed significantly during his absence. New shopping malls stood where markets had once been. Luxury apartment buildings rose above neighborhoods he remembered as modest residential areas. At the airport, they bypassed the regular terminals, driving directly onto the tarmac where a small government jet waited. Sarah explained that this unusual arrangement had been made to ensure Kilmar's safety and to avoid any last-minute complications with his departure. "The State Department doesn't typically provide this level of facilitation," she acknowledged. "But given the Supreme Court ruling and the unique circumstances of your case, exceptions were authorized." As Kilmar climbed the stairs to the aircraft, he turned to Julia, who had accompanied him from La Esperanza to this moment of departure. "Thank you," he said simply, "for believing this was possible when I couldn't." Julia smiled. "Safe journey home, Kilmar. Your family is waiting." The flight to Washington, D.C. took just over 4 hours. Kilmar spent much of it staring out the window at the ocean below, trying to process the rapid shift in his circumstances. This morning, he had awakened in a prison cell. Tonight, he would sleep in his own bed beside Jennifer, would hear Miguel's voice, would step back into the life that had been so abruptly interrupted. Yet he knew that life would not be exactly as he had left it. His deportation and imprisonment had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The psychological impact of being torn from his family, of facing dangers he had fled 15 years earlier, would not disappear simply because he was returning home. And legally, his situation remained complex. The Supreme Court had ordered his return because his deportation violated his withholding of removal protection. But that protection was narrow, applying specifically to El Salvador. His underlying deportation order technically remained in effect, stayed only by the withholding protection. In theory, the government could still attempt to deport him to a third country. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., these concerns receded temporarily, replaced by the immediate anticipation of reunion. Sarah informed him that they would be met by a Customs and Border Protection official who would process his re-entry, and then he would be free to meet his family who were waiting in a private room at the airport. The aircraft touched down as evening fell, taxiing to a secluded area of the airport where a small welcoming party waited on the tarmac. Kilmar recognized Simon Sandoval-Moschenberg among them, standing alongside a uniformed CBP officer and several individuals in formal attire who appeared to be government officials. The re-entry process was conducted right there on the tarmac, the CBP officer recording Kilmar's information and verifying his identity before officially admitting him into the United States. Simon explained that this unusual procedure had been arranged to avoid the complexity of having Kilmar pass through regular immigration controls given his unique legal status. "Where are Jennifer and Miguel?" Kilmar asked as they walked toward the terminal building. "Waiting inside," Simon assured him. "We wanted to make sure all the formalities were completed smoothly before your reunion." They entered the terminal through a side entrance, bypassing the main concourse, and were led to a private room typically reserved for diplomatic receptions. Simon paused at the door, turning to Kilmar with a smile. "Ready?" Kilmar nodded, his heart racing as Simon opened the door. The room was small but comfortably furnished, with sofas arranged around a low table. Jennifer stood as they entered, Miguel's hand clasped tightly in hers. For a moment, all three remained frozen, absorbing the reality of their reunion after weeks of separation and uncertainty. Then Miguel broke free from his mother's grip and ran across the room. "Daddy!" Kilmar dropped to one knee, opening his arms to receive his son's headlong rush. The impact nearly knocked him over, but he steadied himself, wrapping his arms around Miguel's small body, burying his face in the boy's hair to hide the tears that came instantly. Jennifer approached more slowly, her expression a complex mixture of joy, relief, and concern as she noted the visible injuries on Kilmar's face. When she reached them, Kilmar stood without releasing Miguel, who clung to him like a koala, and pulled Jennifer into their embrace with his free arm. "You're really here," she whispered, touching his face gently, careful to avoid the bruised areas. "You're home." "I'm home," Kilmar confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "Because of you, because you never stopped fighting." Their private reunion lasted nearly an hour before they emerged to face a small press conference that had been arranged in cooperation with the immigrant rights organizations that had supported their case. Jennifer had agreed to this on the condition that it be brief and that no one ask Miguel direct questions about his father's absence. Flanked by their attorneys and advocates, Kilmar and Jennifer stood before the microphones, Miguel still glued to his father's side. Simon Sandoval-Moschenberg spoke first, explaining the significance of the Supreme Court ruling and thanking the various organizations and individuals who had contributed to securing Kilmar's return. When it was Kilmar's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief and focused. "Today, I am grateful to be reunited with my family and to return to the community that has been my home for 15 years, he said in careful English. "What happened to me, this should never happen to anyone. I had legal protection from deportation to El Salvador because a judge recognized the dangers I would face there. But I was deported anyway, separated from my 5-year-old son without even being allowed to say goodbye, and imprisoned in a country I fled because of threats to my life." He paused, looking down at Miguel, who remained pressed against his leg, before continuing. "I am standing here today because the Supreme Court affirmed that even in immigration matters, the government must follow its own laws and respect legal protections. I am standing here because my wife never stopped fighting for me, because lawyers believed in justice, because journalists told my story, and because thousands of Americans spoke up about what was happening." Jennifer followed, her voice steady despite the emotion of the day. "This reunion is joyful for our family, but we cannot forget that many others remain separated from their loved ones due to deportations that happened too quickly, with too little review, and with too little regard for human consequences. The Supreme Court's ruling in Kilmar's case establishes an important principle, that the government cannot simply ignore its own legal determinations about the dangers people face in their home countries." After a few questions from reporters, the family was escorted to a waiting car that would take them to Baltimore. As they drove north on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, Miguel finally fell asleep in his father's lap, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day and the late hour. Jennifer reached across to take Kilmar's hand. "When you were gone," she said quietly, "he slept with your pillow every night. He would tell it about his day, thinking somehow his words would reach you." Kilmar looked down at his sleeping son, overwhelmed by the mixture of love and pain her words evoked. "I missed so much," he whispered. "But you're back now," Jennifer reminded him. "Because the Supreme Court recognized what we've always known, that you belong here with us." As they approached their apartment building in East Baltimore, Kilmar felt a complex surge of emotions. Relief at returning to familiar surroundings. Gratitude for the legal victory that had made this return possible. Lingering anxiety about his long-term status. And a new awareness of fragility, the recognition that what had happened once could, theoretically, happen again. But for tonight, those concerns could wait. Tonight was for holding his son as he slept, for reconnecting with Jennifer, for savoring the profound gift of return. As he carried Miguel from the car to the apartment, the boy stirring slightly but not waking, Kilmar made a silent promise. His experience had shown him the devastating human impact of flawed immigration enforcement, the damage caused when administrative systems fail to recognize the lives and relationships at stake in each case. He would find ways to share that understanding, to help others avoid what his family had endured, to contribute to building an immigration system that balanced enforcement with humanity. The Supreme Court's ruling in his case had established an important principle about the government's obligation to follow its own determinations regarding the dangers deportees might face. But principles required vigilant defense, and Kilmar now understood firsthand the distance between legal victories and lived reality. Inside their apartment, everything looked exactly as he remembered, preserved like a museum exhibit of the life that had been interrupted 7 weeks earlier. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter where he had left it that fateful morning before driving Miguel to school. His tools hung in their designated spots on the workshop wall. His side of the bed was made up neatly, waiting for his return. Kilmar gently laid Miguel in his bed, the boy barely stirring as Jennifer helped remove his shoes and tuck the covers around him. They stood together for a moment, watching their son sleep, before quietly retreating to the living room. "Are you hungry?" Jennifer asked. "I can heat up some food." Kilmar shook his head. "Just tired. And still processing everything." They sat together on the sofa, Jennifer curled against him as he tentatively began to share some of what he had experienced during their separation. The shock of being detained while driving Miguel to school. The confusion and fear during his rapid deportation processing. The harsh conditions in La Esperanza. The attack that had left his face bruised and swollen. Jennifer listened without interrupting, occasionally squeezing his hand or wiping away tears. When he finished, she shared her own journey from the moment she received his frantic call from the detention center to the Supreme Court victory that had finally brought him home. "I didn't know I could fight like that," she admitted. "I've never been particularly political or activist. But when they took you, something changed in me. I couldn't accept it. I wouldn't accept it." Kilmar kissed her forehead gently. "You saved my life," he said simply. "The conditions in La Esperanza. I don't know how much longer I could have survived there, especially after the attack." They talked until exhaustion overtook them, falling asleep on the sofa still in their clothes, unwilling to separate even for the short distance to the bedroom. In the morning, they were awakened by Miguel climbing onto the sofa and wiggling into the small space between them, his face alight with the continued wonder of his father's return. "Daddy, you're still here," he exclaimed. "I thought maybe I dreamed you came back." "I'm here, Mijo," Kilmar assured him, heart clenching at the revelation of his son's uncertainty. "And I'm not going anywhere." Over breakfast, they began the delicate process of establishing a new normal. Miguel had questions about where his father had been and why, which Jennifer had previously answered with age-appropriate explanations about a mistake that had sent Daddy to another country. Now, with Kilmar present, they reinforced this simplified narrative while emphasizing that the mistake had been fixed, that the highest court in the country had said Daddy belonged at home with them. In the coming days, there would be medical appointments to address Kilmar's injuries, legal consultations to understand the implications of the Supreme Court ruling for his long-term status, and the practical work of reintegrating into employment and community life. But for now, for this morning, there was just the miracle of ordinary family moments that had seemed lost forever only days before. As Miguel chattered about school and friends and the tooth he had lost during his father's absence, Kilmar exchanged a look with Jennifer across the table, their shared glance acknowledging both the joy of reunion and the work that remained ahead. His case had established an important legal precedent, but the broader issues that had led to his wrongful deportation persisted throughout the immigration system. The Supreme Court's ruling requiring the government to facilitate his return represented a significant victory for legal accountability in immigration enforcement. Yet Kilmar was acutely aware that without Jennifer's relentless advocacy, without attorneys willing to take his case pro bono, without media attention and public pressure, that ruling might have remained words on paper rather than resulting in his actual physical return. How many others, he wondered, faced similar situations without these advantages? How many families remained separated because they lacked the resources to fight back against administrative errors or overzealous enforcement? As Miguel demonstrated his newly missing tooth with exaggerated wiggles of his tongue, Kilmar allowed himself to fully inhabit this precious moment of normalcy. The legal battles, the policy implications, the uncertain future could wait. Today was for healing, for reconnection, for gratitude. 2 weeks after Kilmar's return to Baltimore, the family's attorney requested a meeting to discuss the implications of the Supreme Court ruling for his long-term status. Simon Sandoval-Moschenberg arrived at their apartment on a Sunday afternoon, bringing with him a thick folder of documents and a cautious optimism that balanced legal realism with hope. The Supreme Court's ruling has created an important precedent, Simon explained as they sat around the kitchen table, Miguel playing within earshot but absorbed in his Legos. It establishes that when the government grants protection from deportation to a specific country because of dangers there, they cannot simply ignore that protection and deport someone anyway. But it doesn't change my underlying status, Kilmar noted. Correct, Simon acknowledged. You still have a final order of deportation, stayed only by the withholding of removal to El Salvador. Technically, the government could still attempt to deport you to a third country, though finding one willing to accept you would be difficult given your lack of connection to any country besides the U.S. and El Salvador. Jennifer frowned. So despite everything, despite the Supreme Court itself saying his deportation was wrong, we're still in basically the same position we were before? Not exactly, Simon said. Your case has created visibility and precedent that provides some protection. The administration faced significant criticism for both the error in deporting you and their initial resistance to bringing you back. They're unlikely to target you again, especially given the continued media interest in your story. He opened his folder and spread several newspaper articles on the table. Most featured photos of Kilmar's reunion with his family at the airport, his injured face a visual testament to the consequences of the government's administrative error. Additionally, Simon continued, we've filed a motion to reopen your original asylum case based on changed circumstances. The publicity surrounding your deportation and return has created a new risk factor. You're now known in El Salvador as someone who successfully challenged their government and the U.S. government. That makes you a target in ways you weren't before. Kilmar nodded, understanding the strategy. His original asylum claim had been based on gang threats related to his family's business. This new claim would be based on the visibility his case had received and the potential for retaliation against someone perceived as challenging governmental authority. What are the chances? Jennifer asked. Simon's expression remained measured. Better than before, but still uncertain. Immigration courts have significant discretion, and much depends on which judge hears the motion. What I can say with confidence is that your withholding of removal protection is now even more firmly established after the Supreme Court ruling, and that provides a foundation of security. As Simon outlined additional legal strategies they might pursue, Kilmar's attention briefly drifted to Miguel, who was constructing an elaborate structure from colorful plastic bricks. The boy's world had been shaken by his father's sudden disappearance and equally sudden return. While he seemed to be adjusting well, occasionally Kilmar noticed moments of clinginess or anxiety when separation loomed, even for something as simple as Miguel going to school. These were the hidden costs of immigration enforcement that rarely factored into policy discussions. The trauma inflicted on children, the trust broken, the sense of security shattered. Miguel was receiving counseling to help process these experiences, but some impacts might not become apparent for years. As Simon wrapped up his legal assessment, he shared one final development. There's growing interest in your case from congressional representatives concerned about immigration enforcement practices. Several have reached out about the possibility of your testifying at a hearing on deportation procedures and oversight. Kilmar exchanged a glance with Jennifer before responding. I would be willing to speak about my experience if it might help prevent others from facing what we did. Consider it carefully, Simon cautioned. While congressional testimony could raise awareness and potentially support broader reforms, it would also increase your visibility further, which has both protective aspects and potential risks. After Simon departed, Kilmar and Jennifer discussed the possibility of congressional testimony while preparing dinner together. Their apartment kitchen was small, requiring a choreographed dance of movement as they chopped vegetables and seasoned chicken for a simple meal. I think you should do it, Jennifer said as she diced onions. Your story puts a human face on policies that are too often discussed in abstract terms. People need to understand what happens when the system makes mistakes. Kilmar considered her words as he minced garlic. I'm not a political person, he said finally. I never wanted to be in the public eye. I just wanted to work, raise my son, build our life together. But now that this has happened, you have a platform, Jennifer completed his thought. And platforms are rare for people in your situation. Their conversation was interrupted by Miguel calling from the living room, proudly announcing the completion of his Lego creation. They put the dinner preparations on pause to admire his work, a structure he described as a special house where families can stay together forever. The innocent comment brought tears to Kilmar's eyes. Children absorbed and processed adult concerns in their own ways, building security through play when reality had proven unstable. 3 months after his return to Baltimore, Kilmar found himself in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before a congressional subcommittee on immigration enforcement. Jennifer sat beside him in the hearing room, squeezing his hand reassuringly as they waited for the proceedings to begin. The hearing room buzzed with activity as committee members took their seats and staff distributed materials. Journalists settled in the designated press area, cameras at the ready. Representatives from various immigration advocacy organizations filled the public seating, along with individuals from groups favoring stricter enforcement. When called to testify, Kilmar approached the witness table with the deliberate movements of someone still healing from both physical and psychological injuries. The bruises on his face had faded, but he still carried himself with a wariness born of trauma. "Mr. Abrego Garcia, please raise your right hand," the committee chair instructed, administering the oath to tell the truth before his testimony could begin. With his hand raised, Kilmar felt the weight of the moment. He was no longer just Kilmar Abrego Garcia, construction worker and father from Baltimore. He had become a symbol in the immigration debate, his personal ordeal now part of a larger national conversation about enforcement policies, administrative errors, and human consequences. As he began his testimony, recounting the morning ICE officers surrounded his car as he drove Miguel to school, Kilmar focused on the human aspects of his experience. He described the terror of unexpected detention, the helplessness of being processed for deportation despite his protected status, the dangers he faced in La Esperanza prison, and the Supreme Court intervention that finally secured his return. "I came to the United States 15 years ago seeking safety," he explained. "I followed the legal process, applying for asylum and accepting the court's decisions even when they were not entirely in my favor. When the immigration judge granted me withholding of removal to El Salvador, recognizing the specific dangers I would face there, I believed that protection meant something." He paused, making eye contact with committee members from both political parties. "I discovered that administrative errors can override legal protections, that enforcement can happen so quickly that even valid legal status may not be verified. Without my wife's immediate action, without attorneys willing to work without payment, without media attention and public pressure, I might still be in La Esperanza prison today despite the legal protection I had been granted." The questioning that followed revealed the political divisions on the committee. Some representatives expressed outrage at his treatment, emphasizing the system failure his case represented. Others focused narrowly on the administrative error aspect, suggesting that while unfortunate, his experience was an anomaly rather than indicative of broader problems. One particularly hostile representative implied that Kilmar must have done something to justify ICE's attention, questioning whether he had criminal connections despite the absence of any criminal record. "I have lived in Baltimore for 15 years, Kilmar responded with dignity. "I have paid taxes using my tax identification number, contributed to my community, married, and raised my son to respect the laws and values of this country. I had legal protection from deportation to El Salvador. The only crime I committed was driving my son to school that morning." As the hearing concluded, Kilmar felt emotionally drained but also purposeful. His testimony had forced committee members and those watching to confront the human reality behind immigration enforcement statistics, to acknowledge that errors in the system destroyed families and endangered lives. Outside the hearing room, Jennifer embraced him tightly. "You did so well," she whispered. "You spoke for so many who never get the chance to be heard." Several advocacy organizations had representatives waiting to speak with them, inviting Kilmar to participate in community education events, legal rights workshops, and media opportunities to share his story more widely. The Supreme Court victory in his case had created a platform that extended beyond his individual circumstances. In the months that followed, Kilmar balanced his return to construction work with growing involvement in immigrant rights advocacy. He spoke at community meetings, participated in Know Your Rights workshops, and shared his experience with law students studying immigration law. His testimony was cited in legal briefs challenging deportation procedures, and his case became a reference point in discussions about the need for more robust safeguards in immigration enforcement. The motion to reopen his asylum case based on changed circumstances proceeded slowly through the immigration court system, neither approved nor denied but remaining under consideration as months passed. Meanwhile, his withholding of removal protection remained firmly intact, strengthened by the Supreme Court ruling that had acknowledged its validity. 1 year after his return from El Salvador, Kilmar stood with Jennifer and Miguel on the steps of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., participating in a rally marking the anniversary of the decision in his case. Speakers emphasized the precedent it had established while acknowledging the continued challenges facing immigrants navigating a complex and often unforgiving system. Miguel, now 6 years old, held a sign he had decorated himself with the words, "Families belong together," surrounded by colorful handprints. The trauma of separation had faded somewhat with time and therapy, though certain triggers could still provoke anxiety in the boy, a lasting legacy of those terrifying weeks. As Kilmar addressed the gathered crowd, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had come to America seeking safety, had built a life through determination and hard work, had faced the devastation of wrongful deportation, and had returned through the intervention of the highest court in the land. His story encapsulated both the promise of American justice and its sometimes catastrophic failures. 1 year ago, the Supreme Court affirmed that when the government grants protection from deportation, it cannot simply ignore that protection through administrative convenience or error, Kilmar told the crowd. This principle seems obvious, yet it required litigation all the way to this building behind me to establish it clearly. He gestured to the imposing marble edifice of the Supreme Court. The words carved above those columns read, "Equal justice under law." My experience has shown me that equal justice requires vigilance, advocacy, and sometimes extraordinary efforts to become reality, especially in immigration matters. Kilmar concluded his remarks by announcing the formation of a new organization, Return Home Project, dedicated to identifying and supporting individuals who, like him, had been deported despite having legal protections or strong cases for remaining in the United States. The project would work with attorneys on both sides of the border to locate such individuals, document their cases, and advocate for their return. My story had a resolution that many others never receive, he explained. With the platform my case has created, with the precedent the Supreme Court established, we have an opportunity and a responsibility to extend that justice to others facing similar circumstances. As the rally concluded and families dispersed into the warm Washington afternoon, Kilmar, Jennifer, and Miguel walked hand in hand toward the National Mall. They were meeting friends for a picnic, an ordinary family activity that had seemed impossibly distant during those weeks of separation. Miguel ran ahead, drawn to a group of children flying kites on the open expanse of grass. Jennifer and Kilmar watched him go, allowing him the independence while remaining vigilant, their experience having impressed upon them both the fragility of family security. "Do you ever regret becoming so visible?" Jennifer asked quietly. "Taking on such a public role after everything you've been through?" Kilmar considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There are days when I just want to be anonymous again, to focus only on our family, our home, my work. But then I remember how close we came to permanent separation, how many others don't get the chance to reunite, and I feel I have no choice but to use this platform we've been given." He watched Miguel successfully launch a borrowed kite into the air. The boy's face transformed with delight as the colorful diamond rose against the blue sky. And I want him to see that when injustice happens, we don't just accept it. We fight back, we speak up, we work to change things for others even after our own situation improves." Jennifer nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder as they continued walking. "The Return Home Project is going to help a lot of families," she said. "It's already identified 3 cases of people deported despite having withholding protection similar to yours. The project represented a way to transform their ordeal into meaningful action, to extend the impact of the Supreme Court ruling beyond Kilmar's individual case. Working with attorneys and advocacy groups, they were developing protocols for identifying deportation errors, documenting cases for legal challenge, and supporting affected families both practically and emotionally." As they joined their friends on the grassy expanse of the National Mall, spreading blankets and unpacking food, Kilmar reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had never sought to become a figure in the national immigration debate. His ambitions had been modest: safety, work, family, community. Yet circumstances had thrust him into a role he would never have chosen but now embraced with purpose. The Supreme Court's ruling requiring the government to facilitate his return had established an important legal principle about the limits of administrative action in deportation cases. But principles required continued defense and application to maintain relevance. Through his testimony, advocacy, and the newly formed Return Home Project, Kilmar worked to ensure that the precedent in his case became more than a legal footnote, that it translated into actual protection for others facing similar circumstances. His wrongful deportation had revealed the devastating human consequences of administrative errors in immigration enforcement, the speed with which families could be separated, the dangers individuals could face when returned to countries they had fled. His return through Supreme Court intervention demonstrated that justice was possible even within a deeply flawed system, that advocacy could succeed even against powerful governmental resistance. As evening approached, Miguel returned to their picnic blanket, tired from playing but glowing with the simple joy of childhood. He nestled between his parents, secure in their presence in a way that had once been disrupted but was now restored. Across the mall, the sun began to set behind the monuments and memorials that symbolized American ideals of justice, freedom, and protection against governmental overreach. Kilmar observed the golden light illuminating these structures, reflecting on how his own case had tested those ideals, exposing both their fragility and their resilience. The America that had wrongfully deported him despite his legal protection was the same America whose highest court had ordered his return. The system that had separated him from his family was the same system that ultimately provided the mechanism for reunion. This paradox defined his experience and informed his advocacy, compelling him to work toward an immigration system that more consistently honored its own legal determinations and recognized the human lives at stake in each case. As darkness fell and they packed up their picnic to head home to Baltimore, Kilmar carried with him a complex understanding of justice that few ever acquire, not as an abstract ideal or a guaranteed outcome, but as a possibility that required vigilant pursuit, that could be achieved even after devastating setbacks, that belonged not just to the privileged but to everyone within the nation's borders. The Supreme Court's ruling in his case had affirmed this possibility, establishing that even in immigration matters, where governmental discretion was typically broad, there were limits to administrative action, bounds beyond which enforcement could not legitimately proceed. This precedent would guide his continuing advocacy, inform the work of the Return Home Project, and perhaps, in time, contribute to broader reforms in how immigration law was implemented and enforced. For tonight, though, as he drove his family back to their Baltimore apartment. Kilmar set aside these larger concerns to savor the ordinary miracle of togetherness that had once been threatened. Miguel fell asleep in the back seat. Jennifer rested her head against the passenger window, and Kilmar navigated the familiar route home, grateful for the Supreme Court intervention that had made this simple family evening possible, committed to extending that same justice to others still separated, still waiting for their own journey home. ## key vocabulary, repeated throughout. 1. Deportation order. An official governmental command requiring a non-citizen to leave the country. Example. The deportation order was issued after his asylum application was denied, but he received withholding of removal as protection. 2. Withholding of removal, a form of protection that prevents deportation to a specific country due to danger faced there. Example. Kilmar had been granted withholding of removal to El Salvador specifically because a judge recognized the threats to his safety there. 3. Administrative error, a mistake made by a governmental agency in applying policies or procedures. Example. The government admitted that Kilmar's deportation was an administrative error since they failed to recognize his protected status. 4. Supreme Court ruling, a decision made by the highest court in the United States that establishes legal precedent. Example. The Supreme Court ruling required the government to facilitate Kilmar's return to the United States. 5. Facilitate, to make an action or process easier or more possible. Example. The court ordered the administration to facilitate Kilmar's return rather than simply effectuate it, creating some ambiguity. 6. Effectuate, to put something into force or operation, to cause or bring about. Example. The district court had ordered the government to effectuate Kilmar's return, but the Supreme Court modified this to facilitate. 7. Immigration enforcement, government actions to identify, detain, and remove individuals without legal status. Example. Immigration enforcement policies prioritized speed over accuracy, leading to errors like Kilmar's wrongful deportation. 8. Legal protection, rights or safeguards established by law that prevent certain governmental actions. Example. Despite having legal protection from deportation to El Salvador, Kilmar was erroneously removed to that country. 9. Judicial oversight, the power of courts to review and potentially overturn actions of other branches of government. Example. Kilmar's case demonstrated the importance of judicial oversight in immigration enforcement decisions. 10. Habeas corpus petition, a legal action that challenges unlawful detention or imprisonment. Example. Jennifer filed an emergency habeas corpus petition immediately after Kilmar's deportation, arguing that he had been unlawfully removed. 11. Immigration judge, a Department of Justice official who presides over immigration court proceedings. Example. The immigration judge had specifically ruled that Kilmar could not be deported to El Salvador due to dangers there. 12. Diplomatic note, an official communication between governments on matters of mutual concern. Example. The State Department sent a diplomatic note to El Salvador requesting Kilmar's release from prison. Asterisk. 13. Precedent. A court decision that serves as an authority for deciding subsequent cases involving similar facts or issues. Asterisk example. Kilmar's case established an important precedent about the government's obligation to honor its own determinations of risk. Asterisk. 14. Jurisdiction. The official power to make legal decisions and judgments, often related to a specific geographic area. Asterisk example. The government argued that courts lacked jurisdiction once Kilmar was outside U.S. borders. Asterisk. 15. Motion to reopen. A request asking a court to reconsider a case that has been previously decided. Asterisk example. After his return, Kilmar's attorneys filed a motion to reopen his asylum case based on changed circumstances. Asterisk. 16. Asylum. Protection granted to people who have fled their home countries due to persecution or well-founded fear of persecution. Asterisk example. Kilmar had initially sought asylum in the United States after receiving death threats in El Salvador. Asterisk. 17. Tax identification number. A number issued by the government for tax reporting purposes to people without social security numbers. Asterisk example. Even without permanent legal status, Kilmar had paid taxes using his tax identification number for 15 years. Asterisk. 18. Congressional testimony. Formal statements given to a congressional committee, often under oath. Asterisk example. Kilmar's congressional testimony highlighted the human impact of administrative errors in deportation procedures. Asterisk. 19. Advocacy. Active support for a cause, particularly in promoting rights or policy changes. Asterisk example. Jennifer's tireless advocacy for her husband's return included press conferences, meetings with officials, and public rallies. Asterisk. 20. Due process. Legal requirement that the state must respect all legal rights owed to a person. Asterisk example. Kilmar's sudden deportation without opportunity to present his withholding protection raised serious due process concerns. Asterisk. 21. Immigration status. A person's legal classification regarding their right to remain in a country. Asterisk example. Despite living in the United States for 15 years, Kilmar's immigration status remained precarious and complex. Asterisk. 22. Deportation. The formal process of removing a non-citizen from a country. Asterisk example. Kilmar's deportation to El Salvador violated his withholding of removal protection. Asterisk. 23. Detention. The process of keeping a person in custody, typically for immigration or criminal matters. Asterisk example. After his detention by ICE officers, Kilmar was processed for deportation within 72 hours. Asterisk. 24. Rule of law. The principle that all people and institutions are subject to and accountable to laws that are fairly applied. Asterisk example. The Supreme Court's ruling in Kilmar's case affirmed that rule of law applies even in immigration enforcement. Asterisk. 25. Reintegration. The process of rejoining or becoming part of a community again after separation. Asterisk example. After returning to Baltimore, Kilmar faced the challenges of reintegration into his family and community after the trauma of wrongful deportation. Asterisk. As we conclude this powerful story of Kilmar's wrongful deportation and his journey home through Supreme Court intervention, we're reminded of how legal principles directly impact human lives. Kilmar's case illustrates both the failures and the triumphs of the American legal system, showcasing how even in the most challenging circumstances, justice can prevail when people refuse to give up. His story teaches us important lessons about legal protections, administrative accountability, and the critical role courts play in checking governmental overreach. More importantly, it demonstrates the extraordinary resilience of families separated by immigration enforcement and the power of community advocacy in securing justice. Through Kilmar's journey, we've explored complex legal concepts while witnessing the deeply personal impact of immigration policies. His transformation from a quiet construction worker to a public advocate exemplifies how ordinary people can become powerful voices for systemic change when circumstances demand it. Whether you're learning English or simply interested in understanding immigration issues more deeply, we hope this story has enriched your vocabulary while providing meaningful insight into one of America's most challenging social and legal debates. Did this story help you improve your English while learning about important legal concepts? If so, please take a moment to like this video to help others discover this compelling story. Share it with friends who are learning English or interested in understanding immigration issues. Comment below with your thoughts or any questions about the vocabulary. Subscribe to Story-Driven English for more stories that blend language learning with current events and important social issues. On our channel, we believe that the best way to master English is through engaging with meaningful content that expands both your vocabulary and your understanding of the world. Each week, we bring you new stories carefully crafted to build your language skills through real-world contexts. Join our growing community of learners who use stories about real issues to improve their English comprehension, vocabulary, and cultural understanding. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in our next story.